Woman finds diamond ring on beach. Jeweler turns pale, seeing it. Samantha had grown to cherish her regular walks along the beach ever since she moved into her coastal home. These solitary outings offered her more than just physical exercise. When Samantha first started her beachcombing activities, her attention was primarily captivated by seashells boasting unique colors or captivating geometries. It was on a particularly sun-drenched afternoon, a day when the crystalline grains of sand seemed to twinkle like a sea of minute diamonds under the glorious sunlight, that Samantha noticed something different, an object in the distance radiating an extraordinary brilliance that caught her eye like a beacon. As she lifted the object from its sandy tomb and beheld it in its entirety, her breath caught in her throat. She was utterly dumbfounded. How could an item of such manifest beauty and value end up abandoned upon closer inspection? Samantha realized that she had unearthed a truly dazzling diamond ring. It surpassed any trinket or artifact she had ever found during her beach-walking expeditions, its allure making even the most exquisite seashells look mundane in comparison. Despite a temptation to claim the exquisite find as her own, Samantha's internal moral compass guided her toward a different course of action. As she meticulously inspected the ring, she noticed an engraving etched into its inner band, which read E+J. It was a clue that the ring had significant sentimental value for someone. When Samantha entered the quaint little jewelry shop, she found Mr. Dalton engrossed in the delicate, intricate task of assembling a pair of sapphire earrings. However, the moment his eyes lifted and met hers, his visage transformed from one of concentration to one of warm recognition. Samantha had previously spent countless hours in Mr. Dalton's shop, learning the art of jewelry making under his tutelage. She had successfully transformed seashells and sea-smoothed stones into an array of intricate necklaces, rings, and earrings. Samantha presented the mysterious ring to him, asking, "Mr. Dalton, I found this ring, and it has really piqued my interest. I am particularly curious to identify its owner." Mr. Dalton had altered drastically. The warmth that usually permeated his expressions had vanished, leaving behind an unsettling visage that reflected disbelief, perhaps even a tinge of horror. "How on God's green earth did you stumble upon this ring?" he questioned. Samantha realized that his eyes were not just widened in astonishment, but were moistening at the edges, as if holding back a reservoir of unshed tears. Suddenly, Mr. Dalton broke his self-imposed isolation by grabbing Samantha's arm and locking eyes with her. "Samantha, I urgently need your assistance. It's critical that you drive me to the police station this very instant." As she navigated her way to the police station, Samantha's thoughts swirled in a tumultuous cascade of questions. Did he recognize the ring? Was it an artifact involved in some illicit activities? Once Mr. Dalton began to unravel the complex tapestry of the situation, Samantha was plunged into a state of incredulity so profound it left her almost speechless. The ring in question had an emotionally charged history, steeped in years of love and companionship. Mr. Dalton had meticulously crafted this particular piece of jewelry as an affectionate homage to his beloved wife, Jennifer. Could Jennifer have simply dropped the ring by accident? Or had her mobile phone died, leaving her unable to contact anyone? As they waded through these myriad thoughts, their intense mental bubble was abruptly shattered by a sudden jarring knock on the car window. Standing outside was a uniformed police officer, signaling to Samantha to step out of the vehicle. The officer informed her that given the delicate nature of the situation, and the ring being the sole material clue they had, her account of how and where she discovered it would be indispensable in aiding the ongoing police investigation. "Could you please recount for us, in as much painstaking detail as possible, the series of events that led to your discovery of this ring?" In response, Samantha endeavored to provide a comprehensive rundown of her version of events, omitting no detail she considered even remotely relevant to the case. Back at the precinct, Officer Paula Hawkins launched her formal investigation into the mysterious disappearance of Jennifer Dalton. Mr. Dalton had last laid eyes on his wife Jennifer that very morning, when all had seemed well and perfectly routine. Officer Hawkins got into her patrol car and drove toward the sun-kissed shores. Roughly 10 minutes later, despite the fact that the beach was relatively deserted, Officer Hawkins remained hopeful. In her seasoned judgment, the beach still presented the most logical and promising avenue for locating potential witnesses who could shed light on Jennifer's whereabouts. Unfortunately, her efforts turned out to be largely in vain. None of the few beachgoers she encountered could provide any meaningful insight. Upon reaching a nearby beachside cafe that could potentially have surveillance footage or witnesses, carefully examining the photograph of Mrs. Dalton that Officer Hawkins presented to him, the manager sighed audibly, his face reflecting a touch of disappointment. "You know, we have an extensive security camera network in place here," the manager offered as an afterthought. "One of the cameras even points toward the beach area. If you're willing to take some time to go through the archived footage, it's conceivable you might spot Mrs. Dalton in the vicinity of our establishment." Paula scrutinized each frame with painstaking attention to detail, pausing frequently to assess the faces captured on the video. Suddenly, her eyes caught something, a figure that aroused her interest. With bated breath, she froze the video and stared intently at the image on the screen. There it was, indisputably and irrevocably. She had found Mrs. Dalton on the video footage, approximately 5 minutes into her purposeful walk along the same path Mrs. Dalton was believed to have taken. Some distance ahead, perched on a bench facing the ocean, was what appeared to be a swatch of fabric displaying a distinct pattern. Paula approached the bench with heightened alertness, her eyes widening and her breath becoming shallow as she confirmed her suspicion. There, sprawled on the bench in a disquieting, unconscious state, was Mrs. Dalton herself. A wave of panic washed over Paula as she dropped to her knees beside the elderly woman, her hands trembling slightly as she called out, "Mrs. Dalton, can you hear me? Please wake up!" Just as Paula was on the cusp of dialing for immediate medical assistance, she was struck by a subtle yet unmistakable flicker of movement. Mrs. Dalton's eyelids twitched momentarily before gradually lifting. As her eyes focused and made contact with Paula's intensely worried expression, a look of mild puzzlement washed over her face. "Are you all right, dear?" When Mrs. Dalton finally spoke, the question was so fraught with irony, given the circumstances, that Paula couldn't help but burst into uproarious laughter. "Mrs. Dalton, I think the more pressing question here is, how are you feeling at this moment? Your husband has been in an emotional turmoil, frantic with worry over your unexplained absence." The elderly woman's eyes widened, as if the full impact of the situation had only just hit her. Mrs. Dalton proceeded to unravel the mysteries that had so perplexed Paula. First, she addressed her unresponsive phone, explaining that it had inconveniently run out of battery power. As for the ring, she confessed, somewhat ruefully, that she had indeed lost it while strolling on the beach. Together, they made their way to the patrol car that awaited them. Throughout this entire ordeal, Mr. Dalton had been awash in an unprecedented state of nerve-wracking tension. His wife had never mysteriously disappeared like this before. However, the instant the door creaked open, a radiant glow seemed to illuminate Mr. Dalton's visage, as if he'd been touched by the first rays of morning sun. "Jennifer, you're here! You're alive!" he burst out, pulling her into an emotional bear hug so tight it nearly lifted her off the ground, his eyes welling up and tears streaming down his cheeks. Shifting her gaze to meet her husband's eyes earnestly, Mrs. Dalton spoke in a subdued tone. "Darling, I must express my deep regret for losing that ring. It has always been my most cherished piece of jewelry, laden with sentimental value. I know it means just as much to you, and for that, I am profoundly sorry." Unbeknownst to her, her husband, Mr. Dalton, harbored a delightful surprise that was waiting in the wings, a surprise so sweet and heartwarming that it promised to metamorphose the day's odd and stressful series of events into something infinitely more joyous.